Welcome to another lecture of Psychology 101. I'm your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai, and in today's lecture, we will finish our discussion on the unit on psychological disorders, which corresponds to the last part of Chapter 15. So here we go. Today we will continue our discussion of different categories within the DSM, and on the list today of the things that we will discuss are truly some of the most interesting and some of the most puzzling of psychological conditions. And or not a lot of disorders are more puzzling or more interesting than a category in the DSM called dissociative disorders, which is what we will be talking about right now. And dissociative disorders are a set of conditions that are associated with memory disintegration and problems putting oneself and one's identity into a coherent picture or a coherent whole. So there's usually issues with memory, issues with perception, issues with behavior that has no organic reason or cause whatsoever. It's all psychological. Sometimes these conditions involve a sense of detachment from self or from reality. And more often than not, especially in the dissociative disorder of dissociative identity disorder, which is what we're going to be discussing next, there's often a history of rather severe, unfortunately, childhood traumas and childhood abuse. Perhaps nothing more intriguing and more interesting and no other disorder, perhaps maybe besides schizophrenia, has captured the imagination of the public as well as the imagination of people working in Hollywood than dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. In the DSM-4, this new name of dissociative identity disorder was adopted, and since its adoption in the DSM, and this is going back many editions of the DSM now, there have been this public interest in this concept of dissociative identity disorder, and it all began with a television series that was airing in the 60s and 70s, which was called Sybil, which was about a woman who was suffering from what was then called multiple personality disorder, which is dissociative identity disorder. And it's about her story going to treatment and finding support for this particular condition. And then since then, there have been a number of other media depictions of this particular disorder. United States of Terror, which is it was a series in the early 2000s, and then finally, which is this movie released in 2016 called Split, which is an M. Night Shyamalan movie, which has a very interesting perspective or interesting take about this condition of dissociative identity disorder. And if you're at this slide, I'm going to challenge you to stop the video right here and click on the embedded YouTube clip in this slide in your slide deck, which will give you a depiction of or it's a television show of somebody who or an interview. I apologize. It's an interview with a woman who suffers from dissociative identity disorder. It's a very well done show. So if you do have the time, please do take a look at this particular YouTube clip. Here's the DSM criteria for dissociative identity disorder, or DID for short. So there has to be at least two or more distinct identities, personalities, sometimes called alters. Each of these personalities or alters need to have their own way of interpreting or relating to the world or the environment that they're in. Okay, and the presence of these different alters or these different personalities could either be told by the patient that this is what their experience is like, or it could be observed by other people or this therapist for the purposes of diagnosis, that is. There has to be amnesia around the traumatic event that caused or was very much associated with this type of dissociative identity disorder. And of course, the condition, and much like other categories in the DSM, the condition has to be coupled with some kind of an impairment in daily functioning, and it can't be due to substances, or it can't be due to some kind of a cultural or religious practice. Here are some features of dissociative identity disorder. Typically speaking, people report an average of anywhere from 8 to 15 different subpersonalities. Women who are afflicted with this particular condition report more dissociative identities than do men who suffer from the same condition. And the personalities or the alters can come out almost on a drop of the dime, and they can take over the person's awareness or the person's consciousness, if you will. Having said that, there's usually one primary host personality, and that is usually the original person's identity or personality, which acts as a host for the other identities or alters. Sometimes the different alters are completely unaware of each other's existence, and we call that mutually amnesic relationships. Sometimes they're completely cognizant of one another, and we call that mutually cognizant relationship. Sometimes only one of the alters is unaware, or some of them are unaware while the others are. Sometimes even though one alter takes over at one point or another, so one personality is presented at one point or another, sometimes other personalities may actually present themselves or bleed into the personality that's online. So bleed into their experiences, if you will. So, for example, I'll make it very concrete here because it's probably hard to understand. So, there's been research, for example, on on somebody with dissociative identity disorder, who, in the context of psychotherapy, they told the therapist to give them something to write with, and then they started writing something that the person at the time, the identity or the personality that was present at the time, denied had anything to do with it. And basically the idea here was that another alter or personality is taken over that person's handwriting, and that is sometimes called automatic writing. And sometimes the other personalities make themselves known through auditory hallucinations, very similar to a condition we call schizophrenia as well, which is what we're going to be talking about very, very, very soon here. Here's something that's really quite bizarre, quite puzzling. It's a puzzling feature of dissociative identity disorder. Depending on which alter is present, is here at the time, is cognizant, or is taken over consciousness, if you will, there have been reported differences between the alters' handedness. So some alters are right-handed, others are left-handed. There have been reported differences between the alters' kind of resting brain waves, if you will. Have been reported differences in the alter's blood pressure. So even central nervous system and arousal levels appear to differ depending on which alter is present. Eye acuity, handwriting analysis reveals differences between two different alters that are living in the same individual, writing two different things. Different allergy profiles. Okay, so I'm going to let you kind of take that all in and make of it what you wish. Okay, so these different alters or personalities that live within these patients have differing handedness. Some reports or case studies about different eye acuity, etc. So it's really, really quite interesting and quite bizarre, and has puzzled scientists. So the prevalence of dissociative identity disorder is about 1% in the general population. And some studies, and if you look at this particular table, it shows you the prevalence of dissociative identity disorder depending on whether this is an outpatient, meaning that these are people that go to therapy once a week, for example. They're outpatient, or inpatients that are being examined. So inpatients are people who stay in a mental health facility. Okay, so these are typically people with more severe psychiatric conditions such as bipolar disorder and psychosis or schizophrenia. So we find that the dissociative identity diagnoses are higher amongst inpatients than it is amongst outpatients, but overall there is about a 1% prevalence rate for dissociative identity disorder in the general population. So let's talk about some of the theoretical models that attempt to understand why people develop this particular condition. The first one that I'm going to tell you about is a model called the post-traumatic model. And given the fact that the majority of people who get diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder report a history of childhood maltreatment that is really quite severe and intense, many people believe that the origination of dissociative identity disorder, the development of this condition, very much relates to this early childhood trauma that the patient typically experiences. And the post-traumatic model of dissociative identity disorder names several criteria, if you will, and or several stages that people go through in order to develop a dissociative identity disorder diagnosis. First of which, of course, is exposure to overwhelming childhood stress or trauma. The second is about one's capacity to dissociate from trauma. Okay? And people, of course, differ in their ability to dissociate from their environments or from their, from traumatic events, for example, from dissociate even from the things that they do on a daily basis. The third stage or the third condition is the ability to wall off certain experiences that have been very, very distressing in the past, including the severe childhood distress or childhood trauma that has been experienced. And then finally, given the fact that the person is able to dissociate during moments of extreme trauma, perhaps they developed completely separate memory systems. And within these separate memory systems, you'll probably find these other alters or personalities present. And sometimes these personalities or alters act almost as if they're guardians to the host personality, the actual person, the patient. So they're almost, or sometimes at least, they're almost the polar opposite of who that individual is. So there are other theories of why people develop the condition of dissociative identity disorder. And one thing that we do find is that there is a condition called hypnotic amnesia, where, some people are more susceptible to that than others, where under the influence of hypnosis, some people that are highly, highly suggestible sometimes forget important details on command. Okay, so that is called hypnotic amnesia. So it's really quite possible that, and this is called the self-hypnosis hypothesis of dissociative identity disorder, but it's really quite possible that people who have a very high capacity to dissociate, especially dissociate during times of extreme trauma, may in fact kind of exhibit these types of this type of self-hypnosis, if you will, this ability to almost on command hypnose oneself and forget distressing information. So that's another explanation for these dissociative forms of disorders, which typically are typified by some kind of a break in memory, some kind of a break in one's wholeness of who they are as an individual. And then there's the sociocognitive model of dissociative identity disorder, which tells us, or at least argues, that dissociative identity disorder is iatrogenic, meaning that it's a condition that may not actually be real, but it's one that is created based on the situation at hand. Okay, so this particular model should be very reminiscent of the stuff that we talked about in the unit on social psychology, and basically this model gives a really huge weight or precedent to the power of the situation in making people act in ways that are very atypical or unexpected, at least. Okay, so it's really quite possible, and the argument here goes is that the majority of patients with dissociative identity disorder come to learn about the different alters, etc., in the context of psychotherapy. So that happens more often than not in these cases of dissociative identity disorder. So the sociocognitive model or the iatrogenic model says that it's the therapist, giving off cues as to how the patient is supposed to act in this particular moment. Okay, so and the patient who is supposedly quite suggestible as to so suggestibility means simply to have a higher tolerance for conforming to other people's commands or being obedient to some authority figure. So this level of suggestibility, this quite high level of suggestibility, combined with a therapist that really means well, but perhaps is giving them too much demand characteristics or too much cues about how to act in this particular circumstance, and combined with the already pre-existing trauma, the patient starts acting or enacting these roles that look like split personalities, but may in fact not be that at all. So I want to remind you of one thing. The sociocognitive model of dissociative identity disorder is not saying that people are acting. It's basically saying that under extreme suggestibility and the power of obeying an authority figure, so on and so forth, under those extreme conditions, you get people acting or taking on roles that are expected of them in society. Okay, and this happens beyond the threshold of their awareness. It's almost happening automatically. Okay, so that's what the sociocognitive model says. It's an iatrogenic disorder that's basically created through the power of the situation or the power of suggestion. There have been several treatments that have been quite successful for dissociative identity disorder. The research is really, really lacking here. Given the fact that dissociative identity disorder is such a very, very rare condition, and even though the diagnosis, the prevalence is about 1%, other people have argued against that prevalence, saying that might be a little bit too high. So it's a very, very rare condition, and for that reason, there's hardly any research on the efficacy of these treatments. But there have been treatments that have been developed specifically to deal with the issue of multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder. And the major goal of these trauma-based therapies is to help people to deal better with extreme stressors. So to deal with the stressor as it happened in their life, so retrospectively deal with that immense distress and immense sadness that the person is going through, but at the same time learn new ways to process stressors in their life. But the first step is to stabilize all the symptoms associated with dissociative identity disorder, which happen to be quite debilitating for a lot of people. Let's talk about another relatively rare and also really quite interesting and quite fascinating disorder or set of disorders we call schizophrenia, as I'm sure you've heard of that title before. But before that, let's discuss a little some of the features as well as some of the history of schizophrenia. If you're at this point in the lecture slides, I challenge you to stop the video right here and click on the embedded YouTube clip, which is this blue underlined text here, and watch the video here that I've embedded. It's a YouTube clip with interviews with 4 patients with schizophrenia. It's an extremely debilitating condition. and it's one that is really quite lifelong, as you'll hear soon. However, with the advent of some of these new psychopharmacological interventions, a lot of people live very fulfilled lives, even with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is, like I was saying earlier, one of the most interesting, one of the most puzzling of psychological conditions or categories in the DSM. It's a very pervasive condition. It touches every aspect of people's lives. And for that reason, it is associated with huge functional impairment and loss of functioning. In the acute periods of schizophrenia, you see what we call psychosis. And psychosis is typified by the experience of delusions, or these bizarre beliefs, such as, for example, the government implanted chips in your brains. The government replaced a body part with some kind of a piece of technology, so on and so forth. So that's what a delusion is. It's an elaborate but very bizarre set of beliefs. And then hallucinations is also present during psychosis. And hallucination is the experience of a perceptual event when nothing is actually happening in reality. So, for example, an auditory hallucination is hearing a voice or hearing a sound that didn't actually happen, that wasn't there. And the most common form of hallucination in the acute periods of schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations, which is hearing voices when none are actually there. There's also, during psychosis or during the acute periods of the condition, you also get something called disorganized speech, things like illogical thinking. Also common in the experience of schizophrenia are what we call negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And negative symptoms are anything that the condition takes away from people. And in particular, during bouts of schizophrenia, a lot of people report having lack of appropriate emotional responses. Sometimes we call that flat affect. And overall, just inappropriate emotional responses given the environmental context. Here's a very brief history of schizophrenia, if you will. And the condition of schizophrenia was very first talked about by Emil Kraepelin, who is credited to being one of the very first people to put together a compendium that looks like our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM. And in his very early classification system, Kraepelin pointed out to this condition he called dementia praecox, or directly translated as premature dementia, if you will. And he thought that these what looks like disparate symptoms, very separate symptoms from each other, the delusions, the hallucinations, so on and so forth, he thought they were actually stemming from the same underlying condition, which at the time he called dementia praecox. Okay, and he distinguished this condition actually from manic depressive episode. He said this is an entirely different condition. And at the time he combined even symptoms that look incredibly not like each other. Things like catatonia, which is when people are display this very rigid physiological response, so they hold their hands out in one position for hours on end. Hypophrenia is almost like emotional immaturity and inappropriateness, and paranoia, of course, is having paranoid thoughts that is part of the delusional behavior. And he thought all of these three different presentations of schizophrenia are still schizophrenia. They look different, but they're part of the same condition. Eugene Bleuler, in the turn of the 20th century, was credited with actually putting together the word schizophrenia. Okay, so he's the very first person to call the condition by that name. And the term schizophrenia comes from the Greek for splitting of the mind, which is kind of an unfortunate name in the fact that many people still confuse schizophrenia with multiple personality disorder, when in fact it is not. And I think it is based on this misconceptualization of the condition as having a split mind, if you will. Okay, and it's based on Eugene Bleuler's conceptualization and his coining of that term. And he really believed that these symptoms at the time represented some kind of a dissociative splitting, very much like what we see in the dissociative disorders we just talked about. Okay, and for that reason, he called it schizophrenia, or splitting of the mind in Greek. Here are the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 for schizophrenia. So the person must be showing at least some of these symptoms here, and they have to last for at least a 1 month period. And the symptoms here are some of the things that we've already discussed: delusions, having bizarre beliefs, that is, hallucinations, seeing things that or hearing things that may not actually be there, disorganized speech. Okay, so your speech is tangential, you're very incoherent in your speech. Disorganized or catatonic behavior, like I was mentioning earlier. Catatonic behavior is when people get stuck physiologically, so they're just kind of very rigid muscularly, and they get stuck in place for sometimes hours on end. And the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, which we talked about again briefly, which look like the things that the typical people can do with typically developing people can do without any problem, that the disorder unfortunately takes away from that typical development. And so there has to be 2 or more of these symptoms, and one of them has to be the first 3 symptoms. Okay, and of course there has to be some evidence of deterioration in functioning, and or just the extreme distress when it comes to experiencing such symptoms, and the symptoms have to be continuous on end, if you will. So we talked briefly about positive symptoms. Let's talk a little more about this condition. So positive symptoms is anything that we call a pathological excess, meaning that the behavior is typically not there in the general population. That is, people in the general population do not typically display these behaviors. However, when somebody gets diagnosed with the condition, they show these behaviors. And for that reason, we call them positive symptoms, because they add on or give people something that simply is not there. And positive symptoms generally, including delusions and hallucinations, are extremely common in the presentation of schizophrenia. Anywhere from about 50 to 70% of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia will experience either delusions or hallucinations. And delusions don't have to be these very elaborate or very bizarre types of beliefs. They in fact could be something like Cotard or Capgras syndrome. And these are typified by problems recognizing or having an emotional reaction to people that you actually know. Okay, so Capgras syndrome is when you see familiar faces and you don't have the same emotional connection to these faces, so you start wondering whether these people are imposters. They're impersonating somebody that you know very well. And of course, hallucinations we talked about a little bit, which is the hearing things or seeing things that actually are not there. So it's a perceptual event with no actual corresponding event that happens in reality. So there have been a number of themes to these delusions that people with schizophrenia often exhibit. But overall, delusions, as I have mentioned time and time again, they're bizarre or irrational beliefs. And I think a very important condition here to qualifying whether this is a delusion or not is that the delusions or the beliefs persist despite showing people just a shit ton of evidence against such beliefs. That is the nature of the condition, unfortunately. And the beliefs cannot... they're also inconsistent with the person's beliefs or religious or cultural orientation. So these bizarre beliefs or irrational beliefs or delusions, as we'd like to call them, are really not consistent with the person's background at all. Sometimes these are delusions of grandeur, And we saw that, for example, in the case of Charles Manson, who believed that he was Jesus Christ incarnate. Okay, so delusions of grandeur is when there are bizarre beliefs or delusions regarding your own status, your own abilities, the belief that you're a very special or known person in history that's reincarnated in your own body, the belief that you can solve world hunger, so on and so forth. Beliefs of or delusions of persecution are also quite common in schizophrenia, and delusions of persecution typically look like bizarre beliefs that people are out to get you. Okay, so the belief that the government, for example, is implanting chips in your head. Delusions of reference is when you believe things out there in the world are directly signaling you. They're giving you direct messages. So if you watch the news, for example, and you hear a news story coming out of the news anchor, you may believe, if you have this issue of delusions of reference, that the news anchor is actually giving you this message specifically for you. Or if you're driving on the road and you see a stop sign that says stop, you believe that this is meant for you specifically and it's about something in your life. Delusions of control is when you believe you have control over things that, of course, you there's no evidence you have control over, like people's thoughts, or control over events, or your ability to predict events in the future. So we call those delusions of control. So all of which are quite common in schizophrenia. The most common are delusions of grandeur and delusions of persecution. And I do challenge you to stop the video right here and watch the embedded YouTube clip, which discusses or shows you an example of what a delusion of persecution would look like in the context of schizophrenia. Hallucinations, as mentioned earlier, are the sensory perceptions that occur in the absence of any external stimuli that would signal that sensory perception. Okay, and the most common by far are in schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations, which is hearing voices as well as you hear my voice right now. Okay, that don't have basis in reality. No one is actually talking, and it is by far the most common. But tactile and visual hallucinations are also reported in schizophrenia. However, they're not as common as auditory hallucinations or hearing voices. I do challenge you to stop the video and watch the 2 embedded YouTube clips that, again, show you an example of the horrific nature, really, of these auditory hallucinations, because the voices that people with schizophrenia hear are not these pleasant voices, or the messages that they're hearing are not these pleasant messages. They're actually really quite horrific and really quite nasty things that these people are hearing on a very regular basis. So you can imagine there's a lot of suffering going on in this particular disorder. So this is this particular YouTube clip, and this particular YouTube clip is it's a TED Talk actually from a young woman who suffers from, or has suffered pretty much all her teenage years from schizophrenia, and she's discussing some of her auditory and visual hallucinations that she suffers from the condition, and it's really quite an eye-opening TED Talk. So if you do have the time, do check it out. So we talked about the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. There is a whole slew of other symptoms we call negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and these are deficiencies that typically developing people normally have in the general population. Okay, and they're less common than positive symptoms of schizophrenia, such as delusions and hallucinations. Only about 25% of patients will suffer from negative or report negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And they include things like alogia, which is directly translated as lack of words, which is poverty of speech. They answer questions, for example, when somebody who has schizophrenia is suffering from alogia, they would answer questions with a yes or no, for example. Very, very, very direct, very and very short in the way they talk or discuss ideas. Secondly is anhedonia, which we discussed in the context of schizophrenia in the past, in the context of depression in the past. And anhedonia is the lack of pleasure in things that you usually enjoyed. Blunted or flat affect, You don't get a lot of emotional reaction out of people who are suffering from schizophrenia, who also report experiencing negative symptoms. Avolition, which is this typical apathy, this inability to take initiative to get things done, and asociality, which is the final negative symptom here. Is just and this typically happens also in the prodrome, the months or the period leading up to an acute period of schizophrenia. You often see a lot of asociality, which is just social withdrawal, and it often continues into the active or the acute period of schizophrenia. So these are the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, or the symptoms or the skills, basically, that the disorder unfortunately takes away from patients when compared to the general population. And then finally, there are disorganized symptoms. And these are symptoms that aren't really pathological excesses, aren't really deficiencies. They're just kind of unusual or bizarre, and include things like loose associations. So this is tangential type of speech and thinking. You're connecting ideas that don't necessarily have any connection associated with them, and you're shifting from one topic to another in quite a rapid pace. There's also neologisms as part of this organized symptom presentation, and neologisms are the use of made-up words. Okay, so the words that maybe have a special meaning for the sufferer themselves, but don't necessarily have any meaning in the target language that you're conversing with. There's also perseveration, which is the repetition of words or phrases, and within that you can have something called echolalia, which is a repetition of a part of a word or a word multiple times, and the use of clang, which is the use of rhyming in the way you talk. These are all the disorganized symptoms of schizophrenia. Here's the course of schizophrenia. At least this is what we typically see amongst people who suffer from this condition. And it typically has, or is broken down into 3 separate phases. The first is the prodrome. And this is where typically people report a lot of speech problems, okay, so alogia, etc. And they also report the social withdrawal. So the asociality is really solidified during this prodrome period. However, during this period, there's no positive symptoms that are present. So during the prodrome phase of schizophrenia, you typically don't see a lot of delusions and a lot of hallucinations. And then the active or acute phase is typically triggered by some kind of a stressful event that is really quite, at least from a lot of reports, the stress is often quite distressing and quite overwhelming for the people going through it. And it triggers the acute or the active period of schizophrenia, which typically has a lot of positive symptoms. So this is where these bizarre beliefs and hallucinations are really exhibited during the active or acute period. And finally, there's a residual period, and this is when all the active, the bizarre hallucinations, etc., have really diminished over time. And you still get a lot of negative symptoms, however, during the residual phase. And unfortunately, a number of people who suffer from schizophrenia are in this prolonged residual phase. They're not experiencing the hallucinations. They're not experiencing the delusions to any great extent. However, they are experiencing a number of these negative symptoms that we talked about, including alogia and hedonia, the blunted affect, the apathy, the asociality, etc. And about 25% of people who develop schizophrenia recover completely. Unfortunately, by far the majority of people who suffer from this condition continue to have marked diminishment of their functioning and marked distress throughout their lives. And this is especially true amongst people who develop the condition in Western countries. And there's interesting research about why that might be the case. So here's the 3 phases of schizophrenia kind of graphically shown. So first there's the prodrome, typified by problems in speech and social withdrawal. And then there's the acute phase, again, very much associated with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. This is where all the bizarre stuff, the bizarre delusions and hallucinations, etc., start showing up. And then finally, there's the recovery or the residual period, where much of the positive symptoms that were present during the acute phase are gone, but there's still lots of negative symptoms that just kind of linger around, unfortunately. Let's talk about a few theoretical perspectives or etiological models of that have been forwarded to try and explain how schizophrenia develops. And much like bipolar disorder, and in fact more so than bipolar disorder, schizophrenia is very much a biologically dominant sort of condition, and for that reason, the biochemical models and biogenetic models in schizophrenia have the most research support. And this is something I think that's important to remember. So here are family and genetic studies showing whether schizophrenia is related to genetic relatedness, and it turns out it is. So the prevalence of schizophrenia in the general population is 1%, and the closer you get in terms of genetic relatedness, the higher the chances become of developing schizophrenia if one family member who is genetically related also has schizophrenia. So, for example, if you're an identical twin who develops schizophrenia, there's about a 50% chance that the other identical twin will also develop schizophrenia at some point in their lives. So that is a 50 times increase over what the general population is. So clearly here, genetic relatedness and genes have to play a role in this condition. Other people have forwarded a number of other psychosocial at least models of schizophrenia. One of which is called social labeling. And this was an argument made by a psychologist by the name of Rosenhan in the 1970s. He basically said that having the label of schizophrenia itself and being labeled as such and having that diagnosis of schizophrenia actually functions to exacerbate the symptoms of schizophrenia. And in this video, he specifically talks about how the label in and of itself becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that if you get diagnosed with schizophrenia, people even in psychiatric hospitals, even people who are trained to deal with these conditions, start behaving towards you as if you have this condition for life. And they start changing their behavior accordingly so that the symptoms are kind of locked into this self-perpetuating cycle now. So according to Rosenhan, social labeling at least partially plays a role in the exacerbation of schizophrenia symptoms over time. So I do challenge you to stop the video and watch this little embedded YouTube clip. It's about 2 minutes, and it'll give you an indication of how powerful labels can be in our society, especially labels of such magnitude about mental health specifically. So let's talk about personality disorders. And just to give you a brief overview, personality disorders are more... So in the DSM-4, they were placed in a bigger category of disorders that we call Axis 2 disorders. Okay, so everything that we talked about so far have been, if we're using the DSM-4, that is, everything we spoke about so far has been Axis 1 disorders. And the reason why the DSM up until edition 4 split the conditions into Axis 1 and Axis 2 is because Axis 1 were all the acute disorders, meaning that there was a point in your life, there is a time in your life where not having the condition, not showing these symptoms is possible. And that is true for anxiety, that is true for depression, somewhat true for schizophrenia, because of course during the prodrome and the residual phase, you're not showing the acute phase symptoms that are so much associated with schizophrenia. So all of these conditions that we talked about so far are relatively acute. The DSM-5 did away with Axis 2 and Axis 1 categorization. And Axis 2 is really, they're the pervasive disorders that they're very much intractable. They impact every single aspect of a person's life, and they very much impact the person's personality as to disrupt the way they relate to themselves and other people. And typically speaking, personality disorders are so pervasive and they're always present, basically, because they're part of who that person is. Hence the name personality disorder. So that's how the DSM-4 split these two conditions. There's the acute period or the acute phase disorders, which were called Axis 1, and there's the Axis 2 disorders, which are personality disorders. However, the DSM-5 did away with these categorizations. With this said, personality disorders continue to be defined as these pervasive conditions that impact every single aspect of people's lives, and that impact, and I think this is the hallmark feature, they impact how people relate to themselves and other people around them, which are, of course, quite essential in everything that we do. There are 10 personality disorders that are clustered into 3 different clusters, cluster A, B, and C. I will only discuss one of these personality disorders with you, and that is the borderline personality disorder category, which is a cluster B. And cluster B are all the personality disorders, and there's 4 of them in that particular cluster. All the personality disorders that are typified by the dramatic and the erratic, if you will. And borderline personality disorder is very much typified by instability. And it's an instability in relationships and instability in how one sees oneself, how one sees one's identity. And oftentimes, this instability in identity formation, instability in relationships, creates a very, very emotionally unstable ground, if you will, for the sufferer. So oftentimes there is very much excessive reactivity to real or anything real or even imagined forms of abandonment. So if there's any kind of fear or threat of abandonment, it usually triggers a whole slew of symptoms for the individual. And typically sufferers of borderline personality disorder will also display a number of impulsive behaviors that look like suicidal behaviors or gestures, and oftentimes there's a ton of self-mutilation, so either cutting or burning oneself, etc. And because it's a personality disorder, how people who suffer from this condition see how they relate to other people around them is of paramount importance. So relationships with people with borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis often oscillate between or alternate between extremes. The person, so friends or people that the person with borderline personality disorder thinks about in their head. So whenever they think about a person that they're interacting with, their thoughts or conceptualizations of that person will swing from either idealization, this is the best, most amazing person that I know, this is the loveliest person that I know, they're so sweet, they're so amazing. And if there's any threat to or real or imagined, as discussed earlier, of abandonment from that person, it's almost like a light switch, and the conceptualization of that person in the patient's mind swings the other way completely to the devaluation. So instead of this is the most amazing person, this is an awful, horrible human being. I hate this person. I can't stand them. And it can almost be like a light switch. As mentioned, there is a ton of instability in the way people who suffer from borderline personality disorder see themselves, understand themselves, and understand other people. So there's usually a ton of swinging, if you will, or oscillation between seeing oneself and other people as entirely good or as entirely bad. Okay? So often people who suffer from borderline personality disorder will self-report things like just intense, very intense, profound feelings of emptiness, feelings of abandonment, and again, seeing or conceptualizing or conceiving of rejection anytime they feel like they're alone. Any kind of interpersonal event, even ones that are relatively minor, can trigger things like swift mood changes. People with borderline personality disorder also describe a type of very rigid or dichotomous ways of thinking, and of course, this becomes an interesting target for intervention in something like cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's a particular treatment for borderline personality disorder that is a cognitive behavioral treatment called dialectical behavioral therapy. And in it, there is a lot of focus on this type of rigid or dichotomous thinking, and a focus even more specifically on three assumptions that people with borderline personality disorder often make. For example, sometimes they may have the assumption that I am powerless and vulnerable. I am inherently unacceptable. The world is a dangerous and malevolent place. Okay? So all of these things combined with the lack of coherent conceptualization of self and others makes people with this particular condition extremely hyper responsive and hyper vigilant about any kind of rejection or any kind of abandonment. The good news is very few personality disorders have efficacious or effective treatments. With borderline personality disorder, it is one of the only personality disorders that does, in fact, have a very efficacious treatment behind it. And I mentioned it not too long ago, and it's called DBT, or dialectical and behavioral therapy. And in it, there is certainly a focus on how to manage interpersonal crises. It really helps patients work on these very rigid or dichotomous assumptions, as well as work on having a more coherent picture of who they are or the relationships that they find themselves in. Let's talk very briefly about two childhood disorders, because childhood disorders are, of course, mentioned in your textbook. And if you're still not aware of this, there's absolutely no way for me to cover everything that is in your textbook, given how short of a time we have together. With that said, I will focus on two of the childhood disorders that the textbook goes through. And so why does the book even spend any time, or why am I even spending any time with you talking about childhood-related disorders? Because childhood-related disorders, unfortunately, much like adult disorders, are extremely common. One study, unfortunately, found that 1/5 of all children in North America, so that's 20% of all children in North America, suffer from some kind of diagnosable psychological disorder. Another study that's kind of dated now, in the 1990s, found that basically, close to a third of the sample that they were looking at, the children that they were looking at, was what they called marginally adjusted, meaning that they may or may not actually meet diagnostic criteria for many of these conditions. However, they're showing so much symptoms and so much distress that they would actually benefit from some kind of psychological intervention. And the World Health Organization suggested by a year from now, 50% of all children internationally, or all kids internationally, would have some kind of psychological condition that would impact their disability significantly. So clearly, this is a really big problem, and we need to discuss this. And part of our discussion about this is discussing the diagnostic categories that the DSM puts forward. And one of which that has caught a lot of attention is this childhood condition called conduct disorder. And conduct disorder is any pattern of behavior that violates the rights of others. There's one personality disorder that I didn't tell you about. It's also a cluster B personality disorder, and that is antisocial personality disorder. And antisocial personality disorder is the adult version, if you will, of conduct disorder that looks like a pattern of behavior that is manipulative, that does not show remorse, consistent violations of the law and rights of other people. So that's antisocial personality disorder. Conduct disorder is very similar to that condition, but it's a childhood disorder. And in fact, antisocial personality disorder is one of the only, in fact, it is the only psychological condition or category in the DSM that requires the prerequisite of having a conduct disorder diagnosis in childhood. Okay? So it is very much, antisocial personality is very much a continuation of this particular disorder, conduct disorder. So it's any pervasive pattern of violating the rights of others, and oftentimes there is aggressive behavior towards people and animals, there's destruction of property, and overall this trend of violating the rights of people around this particular child. And research has categorized or has broken the population of kids with conduct disorder into two separate subpopulations, if you will. The first of which is the childhood onset type of conduct disorder. And this is when people or when children start showing signs of this condition very early on in their childhood. And then there's the other kind, which is the adolescent onset, which is when they very first start showing symptoms of conduct disorder in their adolescent years. And the research actually shows us that the first one, the childhood onset conduct disorder, happens to be the much more severe kind of disorder, because I think it puts children at a very young age on a very different etiological trajectory, and it makes it difficult for these children for them to catch up to all the other important developmental milestones that they're missing because of the condition, unfortunately. So typically speaking, the childhood onset is known to be the more severe and less tractable or less treatable kind. Anywhere from about 8% to 8% of boys will develop the condition, and about 3% of girls will develop the condition. So being male is an important risk factor for conduct disorder. So it turns out that the differences between boys and girls kind of evens out a little bit during adolescence. So the numbers that you see here are very much because of the childhood disparity. So there's way more boys, and in fact 4 times the boys that are diagnosed with childhood subtype of conduct disorder than are girls. And then by the time of adolescence, this number kind of roughly equals out. Unfortunately, with conduct disorder is that it's also typified by having a number of comorbidities or co-occurring disorders, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a condition that we'll talk about in a second. And that's about 50% of all cases of kids with conduct disorder will also have a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Learning disabilities are often quite common in conduct disorder diagnoses. Anxiety and, of course, depression are as well. In terms of the etiological picture, there is genetic as well as a parent-child relationship types of models that explain the development of conduct disorder. There is certainly a genetic and biochemical component that many researchers have found. It turns out that the condition of conduct disorder happens to quote-unquote run in families in the sense that the more genetically related you are to somebody who had the condition of conduct disorder, the higher the chances that particular child will also carry the gene and will later on develop the condition. And also there have been a number of models that talk specifically about the role of the relationship between parents and children. And in fact, some of the most successful treatments for conduct disorder come in the form of parent-child relationship interventions, where this very problematic, inadequate type of parenting and inadequate type of parenting style is directly addressed, and parents are taught by the therapist or whoever is conducting the intervention to deal with the child who has conduct disorder in an evidence-based way so that the symptoms are relatively contained. And like I said earlier, there have been a number of studies to show how powerful parent-child interventions are for conduct disorder. So let's talk briefly about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It is a very common condition in childhood, and in fact, the prevalence is going up. Part of the problem with diagnosing attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is that it's, of course, very common for all children to be quite active and energetic and, act in very impulsive or non-inhibited ways, if you will. With that said, if a child is diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, typically speaking, and I'm not saying this is done appropriately, the diagnosis is done appropriately every time it's done, but typically speaking, when a child is diagnosed with ADHD, they are showing a much higher severity of these issues that I talked to you about, which is they're showing much higher energy level, they're showing much higher activity levels, and as is the hallmark feature of the condition, they're showing much higher or much lower ability to control their impulses or inhibit inappropriate behaviors than typically developing children. Okay, so if you meet that diagnostic criteria, chances are, again, if the diagnosis is done appropriately, of course, which is a big ask sometimes, but if the diagnosis is done appropriately and the person has been appropriately diagnosed, then the child will typically be showing levels of inhibition that are much higher than the general population of children. And unfortunately, and given that this is very much a behavioral disorder, that if you meet diagnostic criteria, you're likely showing inappropriate behavior during that age. These kids are often very much harshly judged, and they're often harshly judged as they're lazy, they're unmotivated, they're selfish. So that makes things very, very difficult, as you can imagine, having these labels on these children who are showing these signs of this condition, because it increases stigma and comes in the way of people genuinely wanting to seek help and get better from this condition, or at least make the lives of their children a little bit better. Anywhere from 4 to 9% of all school children will display attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or will be diagnosed with that condition in accordance with DSM criteria. And boys will outnumber girls 3 to 1. If you remember our discussion in the very beginning of this unit on psychological disorders, the symptoms cannot be interpreted in a vacuum, and if a diagnosis or an appropriate diagnosis is to be made, one has to contextualize the child's symptoms into appropriate socio-historical context. Different cultures may interpret the symptoms and the appropriateness of the symptoms differently, of course. And for that reason, especially if the child is not from the dominant culture, there has to be a lot of work to figure out whether the child's behavior is normative for their particular culture and their particular family or not. Okay? So it looks like the lower you go in the socioeconomic status ladder, the higher the rates of ADHD diagnoses. And unfortunately, if the the symptoms are not managed appropriately, oftentimes the symptoms persist into adulthood. Anywhere from 35 to 60% of people who are diagnosed as children continue to have ADHD diagnoses as adults. So the symptoms must be, especially if they're relatively severe and meeting diagnostic criteria, the symptoms should probably be appropriately managed. And the most prevalent form of symptom management for this particular condition is psychopharmacological in the form of psychostimulants. And we will talk about that in our psychological treatments section. Here are the core symptoms of ADHD. And ADHD typically is broken down into three subtypes of ADHD. There's the inattentive type, which is the symptoms that I'm showing you here. And then there's the hyperactive or impulsive type. And then there's the combination of both, which is the third type. But here are some of the common symptoms in the inattentive type of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So there's problems or inability to sustain attention or persist at doing something important at work or even persist at play activity. Sometimes they have a very hard time remembering or following through on rules or instructions given by teachers or given by parents, for example. They have a very hard time resisting distractions. And oftentimes the guardians or the teachers of children who show the inattentive type of responding will complain that the child can't concentrate, can't finish tasks on time, or they're really quite forgetful. Here's the hyperactive or impulsive type of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it is typically typified by excessive levels of fidgetiness, getting out of your seat more times than you need to, climbing, touching things, interrupting other people inappropriately. Parents and teachers will also give a description of these kids as kind of like driven by a motor, if you will. They're constantly in motion, always on the go, and have a very, very hard time to wait for things to happen. Research also shows that these kids happen to talk more than other kids their age, and they have a very, very hard time to stop or inhibit themselves from doing a certain behavior or resist immediate temptations in their environment. Okay, so it's kind of a similar presentation to inattention with more of these this inability to kind of sit down and limit your fidgetiness and limit the inappropriate behavior given your age. Until next time.